Is going to be about a security assessment of the Internet Protocol version 6. As a presentation of about myself, I work as a security research for C6 Networks, and over the last few years I have been working on a number of projects for the UK NIC and UK CPNI on the security assessment of networking protocols. I'm also a member of a research and development group in a university in Argentina, and I'm also an active participant at the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the standards organization for Internet protocols. And that's the URL for my personal website when you can find more information about my activities and publications. So this is the agenda for this presentation. The idea is to discuss a little bit what's the motivation for having this presentation in this conference. Try to perform a brief comparison of IPv6 and IPv4, so that in the event that you are not familiar with the IPv6 protocols, let's say that I can bring you to a decent level so that you can join the rest of the presentation. And then we will go through different aspects of IPv6 security, from basic security implications in the core protocols to security implications of the corresponding transition and coexistent technologies, and finally some security implications of IPv6 on IPv4 networks. So in the event that you have never heard about IPv6, this is like a very rough introduction to the protocol. IPv6 was developed more than 10 years ago to address the problem of IPv4 address exhaustion. It has not yet been widely deployed. The latest measurements that article reading about estimated that less than 1% of global internet traffic was IPv6, which is of course a very, very small percentage. Actually, I would say that it's something like close to 0.5% or something like that. On the plus side, IPv6 is supported by most general purpose operating systems. So that is not by itself a barrier to IPv6 deployment. IPv6 has been largely ignored for many, many years. And on the last few years, ISPs and other organizations have begun to take IPv6 more seriously, probably as a result of a number of events that happened during the last few years. One of them was the exhaustion of the central pool of free IPv4 addresses at IANA. IANA is the organization that administers the IPv6 and IPv4 addresses. They assign IPv4 and IPv6 addresses to regional registries such as RIPE in the case of Europe, APNIC in the case of Asia Pacific, LACNIC in the case of Latin America, and so on. So last year, in February, if I recall correctly, the central pool of IPv4 addresses, free IPv4 addresses at IANA, got exhausted. And that event got its share of press. And that was like a sign for the industry that the IPv4 address space was really exhausted. There were also some awareness activities. For example, you may have heard about the World IPv6 Day last year, June the 6th last year. During the World IPv6 Day, major content providers such as Google, Facebook, and others enable IPv6 on their production servers. And this year we had a different awareness event, the World IPv6 Launch Day that you may have heard about, which was like the World IPv6 Day, but with the difference that all of those major content providers enable IPv6 on their production servers for once and for all. So if right now you were to check whether Facebook, Google, and others support IPv6, you'll find that you will find IPv6 addresses for them. So in the event that you have V6 address, V6 connectivity, you can already visit and browse those sites by means of IPv6. You no longer required to have IPv4 to use those services. After the exhaustion of the central pool of IPv4 addresses, it came to focus predictions about when the address pool of each of the regional registries would exhaust. For example, in the case of APNIC, the regional registry for Asia Pacific. They have already exhausted their IPv4 address space. So if you are in the Asia Pacific region and you need, for example, IPv4 addresses, then AppNIC cannot assign you any more IPv4 addresses. Some ISPs may still be able to do that, but you cannot really request any more IPv4 addresses from AppNIC. Other regions are following. I think that estimations for RIPE is that they are going to exhaust either this year or next year, and probably the regions of the world that will get to complete before exhaustion later will be the Latin America and the Africa regions, and of course that has to do with the level of development of those regions. As a result of all these things, it finally looks like the IPv6 is going to take off. This doesn't mean that we have the level of V6 deployment or use that we would like to have. Of course, we are completely far from that. But what has changed is that in many, if not most organizations, they are at least thinking about IPv6, and they are doing something that they were not doing maybe a couple of years ago. That may have to do with training for their technical personnel. Maybe they may have changed their policy for purchasing networking gear. They may have started already to produce a plan for IPv6 deployment, whether it's this year, in the next year, in the next few years, but they are doing something about it. So what's the motivation of this presentation? If you have ever read a little bit about IPv6, it's very likely that you may have read or heard some of the myths that I'm mentioning in this slide. Some of the things that you usually hear about V6 security is that, for example, security was considered during the design of the protocol, and many people assume that as a result of that, which in practice didn't happen, IPv6 is more secure than IPv4. There are other claims or myths. For example, some people argue that with IPv6, the typical security paradigm that in general we enjoy right now, which is rather network-centric, will change to host-centric. There's other people that argue that, for example, with IPv6, we will have increased use of IPsec, and the sort of claims and myths that you may hear could continue. You not only hear myths about security, but there's also myths in terms of functionality. It's not unusual to hear things such as IPv6 providing improved quality of service supports and other things. And in this presentation, I'm just focusing on the security aspects. One of the problems with these myths is that in many cases, organizations and people deploying the protocols assume that all of the things that they hear are correct. So they assume that they don't have to pay much attention about V6 security, because if the protocol is secure by default, it's not much that they need to do about it. So these myths, they end up having negative implications on the resulting deployments of IPv6. What this presentation will try to do is to try to analyze some of these myths and try to analyze to what extent they are true and to what extent they are more of a urban legend. And in this presentation, we won't focus, of course, on specific vulnerabilities, because the idea is to have like a more general view of V6 security. So rather than focusing on specific attack vendors, packets, bits, and bytes, for the most part, I'm trying to give you like a different perspective from the one that you will probably typically hear about V6 security, and try to influence the way in which you think about this. So first of all, let's make a few general considerations about V6 security. Typically, for us, technical people, we are usually more prone to start analyzing bits and bytes and try to find vulnerabilities in protocols. But in practice, when you analyze any technology, there are a number of factors that affect the effective security that technology actually has on a network. So this slide tries to provide a summary about some of these aspects. Probably one of the most important aspects is that we have much less experience with V6 than with V4. And that's, from my perspective, a very important aspect, because no matter how good or bad a technology might be, the level of expertise that you have with that technology plays a key role to the resultant security that you get with that technology. Maybe you want to deploy a technology that is not that good from a security standpoint, but if you know that technology by heart, then you may be able to mitigate the security aspects that technology has. Of course, in the case of IPv6, that's not the case. So regardless of the technical aspects of the technology, you will see that in many cases, some of the flaws that you will find in V6 deployments have to do with that lack of experience rather than with technical properties of the protocols themselves. Another aspect that is very important too is that of the the maturity of IPv6 implementations. If, for example, you take a look at CertCC website and try to find out vulnerability advisories for IPv4 and IPv6, probably you will find at least a double number of advisories for V4 than for V6, maybe even more. And many people think that the reason for which we have fewer advisories for V6 is that because the protocol is more secure. But from my perspective, that's actually an indication that we still have to find lots and lots of bugs in V6. So eventually, in the near term or long term, we will probably find that we have a similar number of advisories for V6 and for V4 implementations. I would probably argue, even when it may be politically incorrect, that in terms of robustness of IPv6 implementations, we probably are in the same level as we were with IPv4 in the 90s, or maybe even earlier. So that means that there are lots of bugs to be found in V6 implementations, many of which may have security implications. Another important aspect, particularly for the people that are working in the operations area, is the support that you may find or that you can find in security devices. Let's say that you take a look at a firewall or any other security device. It's very likely that that device has this and that other security features. And if you look at the number of features that the same device has for IPv6, in many cases you will find that there are no IPv6 support at all. In other cases, you will find that there is support for some features, but there is no parity of features between V4 and V6, so that you have much more functionality in V4 than in V6. And in some other cases, you will find that even when maybe the features that you have for both protocols may be similar, sometimes, for example, the IPv4 functionality is implemented in hardware, whereas the V6 functionality is implemented in software. So in terms of features, the functionality is essentially the same, but when it comes to performance, it's completely different. So that's another aspect to consider. And the reason for which this aspect is particularly important is because no matter the technical properties of the protocols or the level of expertise that you may have, you need these kind of devices to actually work with these protocols in a real network. So these are the devices that actually allow you to improve the security of your IPv6 deployment. Another aspect that will affect everyone, not just people doing IPv6 deployment right now, is that the complexity of the resultant internet will increase, and quite a lot. If you think about it, we will be running two internet protocols in parallel, which means that if you have dual stack deployed in a computer network, you will be running IPv4 and IPv6 in parallel, essentially two logical networks that are overlapping on the physical network in many cases. You will also see that there will be increased use of NATs, and this may sound ironic to many of you because you typically hear that with IPv6 we will get rid of NATs, but in practice the problem is that we have only a few addresses, only a few IPv4 addresses. So for example, we need to deploy more and more NAT devices in the IPv4 world so that we can share the remaining IPv4 addresses that we have. And on the other hand, for example, if you have an IPv6 only deployment, which some people, for example, plan to do for mobile networks, you may need a NAT or a translator device that allows an IPv6 only host to communicate with IPv4 only host. So there will be many different places in the network in which we will deploy more of these NAT devices. In the same way, we will have an increased use of tunnels and other transition technologies. Of course, in many parts of the networks, we will have IPv6 islands, but on the core of the network, we may have IPv4 only. So we will need to deploy some tunneling technology so that we can tunnel our IPv6 packets over the IPv4 network. The result with this is that the complexity of resulting network will be increased, and this will mean that even if you are operating what's supposed to be an IPv4 only network, in many cases you will have to deal with all of these devices and with all of this complexity. So even if you are not in the security field and you're just a network operator that is running a network and doesn't care that much about security, this will affect your work too. Because when you are doing troubleshooting, you will need to take all of these aspects in your everyday life. And finally, to add on top of all of this, is that there is a lack of well-trained human resources. And this is very hard to prove if you, let's say, if you are working at an ISP and let's say you have 100 people working for you, and if you ask them how many of them have V6 expertise, at least some IPv6 expertise, you will see that if you have 100 people, maybe 10 of those 100 people have V6 expertise. Not to mention the fact that the level of expertise that they may have in V6 when compared to before, it's completely different. So this doesn't really look as good as it should look. But unfortunately, in many cases, if not most cases, IPv6 will be the only technology that will allow you to remain in the business of communications. To put it in another way, if you are an ISP, a mobile operator, or whatever, you need those IP addresses to be able to add more customers to your network. So you may, to some extent, extend the life of your IPv4 network with some translation or NAT technologies, but that kind of workaround doesn't scale. So eventually, sooner or later, you will need IPv6 for your network to be able to grow. The bottom line with this is that from my perspective, nobody deploys IPv6 because they like it or because they love it, but they deploy it because they need it. So the idea is that you don't really need to be happy with IPv6 to do something about it. You need to do something about IPv6 because you need to have IPv6 on your network, eventually. So I will do a very brief comparison between V6 and V4. The idea of this comparison is in the event that you have never heard about IPv6 at all, or you have heard about it, but you don't really know what are the mechanisms or the technology that are behind it, that you can kind of get an idea of what this protocol is about, what features it has, and how it works. This is a very rough comparison of both protocols. The most important feature of IPv6 is the increased address space. That's the only motivation for deploying it. So even when you will hear marketing claims such as, well, with V6 you will get improved quality of service, improved security or whatever, the only reason for which people are deploying it is because we need the increased address space that IPv6 provides. Before addresses, of course, are 32 bits. IPv6 addresses are 128 bits, which of course is a much larger address space. And then when it comes to other, let's say, other features or other categories of the protocol, for example, you have similar functionality but implemented with different mechanisms. So for example, when it comes to address resolution, before you do it with ARP, whereas in the case of IPv6, you do the address resolution with ICMP version 6. You don't use ARP packets, you use ICMP version 6. Same functionality, you are doing exactly the same thing, but you're just using a different mechanism, different packets, different protocols. When it comes to auto configuration, in V4, it's typically done with the HCP and ICMP router solicitations and advertisements. Of course, the most popular, if not probably the only popular of these mechanisms is the HCP. But in any case, I'm noting that V4 supports some basic auto configuration support with ICMP. And in the case of IPv6, auto configuration can be provided by ICMP messages. On one hand, that's called stateless address auto configuration, or it can also be provided with the HCP version 6, which is of course analogous to the V4 counterpart. When it comes to fault isolation of course being the property of the network or the ability of the network of being able to report problems to the nodes sending packets, it's done with ICMP in the IPv4 case, and it's done with ICMP version 6 in the IPv6 case. This is probably one of the areas in which these two protocols are most similar of all. Of course, the syntax of the packets, it changes, but essentially the protocol is the same. When it comes to IPv6 support, it's optional for both protocols. It used to be mandatory for IPv6, but that requirement was removed. And finally, when it comes to fragmentation, in IPv4 is done both in host and routers, where in the case of IPv6 it's only done in host. The reason for changing that is to avoid having that performance penalty on the routers. Of course, this slide is just trying to address the most basic mechanisms of IPv6. We have other things such as mobile IPv6 and mobile IP in the case of before, but in most cases you will have to deal with this basic functionality as opposed to the more advanced features. So let's talk a little bit about the security implications of IPv6. I will just go through some of them. We could probably spend hours talking about the implications of different mechanisms. So I will just discuss some of them which are interesting, probably because of some myths that have been built around these things. So one of them is the security the implications of IPv6 addressing on host scanning. And as a kind of introduction to the topic of IPv6 addressing, again, it's the main driver of V6 deployment. V6 addresses are 128-bit long, and other than that, they are essentially the same as in the IPv4 case. For example, the semantics of the addresses are very similar. Addresses are aggregated into prefixes when you want to route packets, so you will find the routing table in IPv6 which looks very similar to the one in before, with the only difference, of course, being in the length of the prefixes. There are different address types, so in the same way as in IPv4 you have, for example, unicast, multicast addresses, you have the same thing in IPv6. And finally, you have different address scopes, which is, again, the same thing or very similar to before. In before, you may find, for example, private addresses, which are supposed to be valid only on a local network if you want. You have linked local addresses, you have global addresses, and you have the same sort of thing in IPv6. Probably the only aspect in which things are a little bit different is that typically in the IPv4 case, if you look at the configuration of a network interface card, you typically have a single address assigned to that interface, whereas in the case of IPv6, you usually have more than one address assigned to one network interface. So it's not unusual, for example, to see that for a network interface card, you may have, for example, one linked local address, a couple of global addresses, and so on. But that's it when it comes to the similarities and differences between the two protocols. Since this discussion or these next few slides are going to be about host scanning attacks, the only address type that we are going to focus on is on the global unicast addresses, which are, of course, the addresses that you use for communication on the public internet. So this is the syntax of IPv6 global unicast addresses. If you think about it a little bit, it looks very, very similar, if not exactly the same as in the IPv4 case. You have a global routing prefix that is assigned by your upstream. So if you, let's say that you request a prefix to your, let's say, ISP, well, that ISP will assign you a global routing prefix. Then you have a few bits for subnetting, same thing as you do with IPv4. And finally, you have an interface ID, which is analogous to the host ID that you find in IPv4 addresses. So it's essentially the same as in IPv4, the only difference being in the size of the address. The interface ID is typically 62 bits long, and probably one of the differences when you compare the interface ID to the IPv4 counterpart is that in the case of IPv6, you have different ways of selecting the interface ID. Probably because since the interface ID is much longer, you have many more options to select the interface ID than just trying or just assigning all the possible interface IDs consecutively. So one of the possible approaches for selecting an interface ID is to include or embed the link layer address of the network interface. So essentially what you do in that case, you take the MAC address of the network interface card and you include that address in the interface ID. You have to flip a few bits, you have to insert a few bytes in between, but the basic idea is you just put the MAC address inside the interface ID. There is a different technique that is usually called privacy addresses or temporary addresses, and it basically has to do with randomizing the interface ID. So essentially, to put it simply, you just select a random number and you put that number in the interface ID. You have other option, which could be, for example, to manually configure the interface ID. That's the same thing that you usually do with before. So let's say that you don't want to rely on DHCP for some reason. For example, you are configuring the address of a router or of a server or whatever. So rather than selecting the address automatically, you just configure the address manually. Typically, in that case, what you do is you set the interface ID to all zeros and you just vary the last byte. And last but not least, there are some transition and coexistence technology that essentially dictate the way in which you need to select the interface ID. We will not get into the details of this particular category, but I just wanted to know that in some cases, the interface ID, in some cases you don't have like complete liberty as to how to select the interface ID. So this is one of the associated myths that you typically hear about IPv6 host scanning attacks. And the claim in this case is that IPv6 host scanning attacks are invisible, and you usually hear things such as they would take like 500,000 years or things like that. And usually the reasoning with which these people come up with those big numbers is that they assume that the interface ID is randomized. So if you think of interface IDs as being 64 bits long, and you assume that the attacker would have to try every possible address in that subnet, then in those cases, yes, it would take ages for a host scanning attack to be performed. What's interesting is that that's not exactly what happens in practice. So when I was studying this particular aspect, I came up with this paper, which is a little bit dated, but in any case, it provides an interesting data point. So this guy, David Malone, essentially measured IPv6 address generation in the wild, in real networks. And what this guy did was essentially, for one of the experiments that he did, he set up, I think it was a web server, so he had clients connecting to his web server. He logged every of the addresses of those clients and then tried to analyze what was the algorithm or the technique that was being used to select the interface IDs. So this guy came up with these categories for the addresses. The first one is SLAC, or addresses that embed the MAC address of the network interface card. Then there's another category that is IPv4 based addresses. If you look, for example, at the here, you'll see that the IPv6 address syntax allows you to, let's say, include an IPv4 address as part of the IPv6 address. So in some cases, you find those addresses too. There are also low byte addresses, which are these ones here, in which you can see that the interface ID is all zeros, and it's just the last byte that changes. That's typically the result of manual configuration. So let's just say that you are configuring the addresses of routers. You don't usually just type like lots of random numbers, but you want addresses that are easy to remember. So you typically select the interface ID to all zeros and you just vary the last byte. There are also privacy addresses, which is this category, in which you essentially randomize the interface ID. So there's no real pattern there. There's also worthy addresses. And essentially, worthy addresses encode either words in English, Spanish, French, whatever. And there is one of the reasons for which you can do that is since you're using hexadecimal here, it's possible to do that, whereas in the case of IPv4, it's not. Just as an example, if, for example, you obtain the IPv6 address of www.facebook.com, you'll see that the resulting IPv6 address encodes the word Facebook in the IPv6 address. It's not that those addresses are that common, but those addresses happen in practice. And finally, you have addresses that result from the use of transition technologies. Again, as I mentioned before, when you use, for example, transition technologies such as Tirido or 624, then those technologies mandate the way in which, for example, you should select the interface ID. That's the case, for example, with Tirido. That's the case with iSetup, if I recall correctly, and a few others. So these are the results that David Malone got in his paper. The paper is publicly available online, so that's why I'm providing the reference here. It's an interesting one. So this guy measured the IPv6 address generation for both hosts and routers. In the case of host, these are the numbers that he got. 50% of addresses include the MAC address of the corresponding network interface. Then you have a 20% of addresses that are IPv4 based, so that in the interface ID you have an IPv4 address encoded. You have a 10% of Tirido addresses, 8% of low byte addresses, and the rest of the categories, the percentage of the rest of the categories is very, very small. In the case of routers, the numbers change quite a lot. You can see in this slide that you have a 70% of low byte addresses, which shouldn't be a surprise, because in the case of routers, you typically manually configure their addresses, so you don't include the MAC address in the network interface or anything else. But in most cases, you just set the interface ID to all zeros and you just change the last byte. And even when we could continue the discussion, for example, about what are the patterns that each of these categories follow. Just as an example, I could mention that in the case of Slack addresses or addresses that include the MAC address, those addresses within themselves, they follow some patterns. For example, if you think about virtualization technologies, all of them use MAC addresses from a specific IEEE OUI, so they have internal patterns themselves. But the general idea that I would like to give you with this slide, and that I think should be clear from this slide, is that the IPv6 addresses are not randomized, but they follow very clear patterns. So that assumption that is made about IPv6 addresses being random is not actually correct. So in practice, IPv6 host scanning attacks are feasible, and they have actually been seen in the wild. If you follow, for example, mailing lists such as that of Nano and other operations group, you will see that some people have already reported some of these scanning attacks in the wild. And what will probably change from the V4 case to the V6 case is that the scanning attacks will be less brute force. Probably the reason for which we employ brute force techniques for doing IPv4 host scanning attacks is that the address space is so small that even if you do a brute force scan, that's good enough. But in the case of IPv6, if you were to try just random addresses, the host scanning attacks will be infeasible. So that's why that's why the attackers are likely to implement more elaborated techniques. There are lots of work to be done in this area. For example, scanning tools could leverage patterns in IPv6 addresses. They could also, for example, leverage leaks in application layer protocols. Just as an example, it wouldn't be a surprise for me to see that some attacker implemented some script that can look at the header of email messages that are posted on archives of different mailing lists and try to look up addresses from there. They could also try to look up IPv6 addresses from torrents and other application protocols, so that's possible. And also, for example, for local networks, there are a variety of techniques that you can employ. For example, using multicast addresses, exploiting neighbor discovery, exploiting other protocols such as multicast DNS or link local name resolution in Windows systems and so on. So there's lots of work to be done in this area. And just as a data point, if you look at the support that you can currently find in popular scanning tools such as Nmap, is very, very basic support. So they typically don't implement any of these techniques. I have reasons to believe, to put it in some way, that this year you will see many of these tools published. So there are quite a few of us working on this kind of scanning tools, which we plan to release anytime soon. As a kind of recommendations to mitigate these host scanning attacks, of course, what we should be doing to leverage the increased IPv6 address space is to avoid any patterns in IPv6 addresses. Unfortunately, that essentially means that in many cases we will have to update the corresponding standards. You can find in this slide the file name of an IETF internet draft that we have published, which proposes an alternative approach to selecting interface IDs such that these host scanning attacks can be mitigated. And of course, it's also possible, and you should probably consider the use of firewalls and network intrusion detection systems, which could be very useful to prevent or mitigate these kind of attacks. If you think about it, for a typical IPv6 host scanning attacks, you are very likely to get lots and lots of packets sent to your network, and many of those packets will be sent to non-existing addresses. So it shouldn't be hard to actually detect that you are being subject of a host scanning attack. A few comments about the implications of IPv6 servicing on end-to-end connectivity. As a kind of overview, if you look at the IPv4 internet, the original design of the IPv4 internet, it used to follow what's called the end-to-end principle. The end-to-end principle usually implies a number of things. For example, that you have a dumb network and smart host. So the network essentially just forward packets and does nothing else other than that. Another aspect is that if 20 years ago, 25 years ago, if you were to connect a device to an IPv4 network, that device could communicate with any other system in the network. And yet another aspect is that the devices that you had deployed in the network, they didn't inspect the payload of the resulting IP packets. Of course, that was the internet 20 years ago, 25 years ago. That essentially changed completely. So nowadays you have lots of intelligent devices deployed in the network, from network intrusion detection systems to firewalls and others. And two of the devices that are probably responsible for removing this end-to-end principle from the internet are NATs and firewalls. Essentially, both NATs and firewalls need to inspect the contents of packets, so they essentially violate most, if not all, of these aspects that we discuss here. Many people expect that since IPv6 by itself doesn't require the use of NATs because we have plenty of address space, they think that as a result of IPv6 deployment, the end-to-end principle will return to the internet. So this is the myth that is related to this aspect. Many people argue that with IPv6 deployment, the end-to-end principle will return to the internet. That is usually assumed to be a good thing. People argue that the end-to-end principle fosters innovation, and to some extent that makes sense, because if, for example, the network doesn't inspect the contents of your packets and so on, then it would be trivial, for example, to design, develop, and deploy a new transport protocol. Nowadays, if you were to deploy a new transport protocol, that protocol could never be deployed because it couldn't traverse NATs, firewalls, and so on. So I'd say that the problem with this claim or this myth is that most people assume that of having plenty of address space necessarily implies, for example, that you will have end-to-end connectivity. And those are two completely different aspects. You may have global addresses assigned to every node, but that doesn't mean that you will allow any node to communicate with any other node. One of the reasons for that is that even when that end-to-end connectivity might foster innovation, in most cases networks don't care about innovation. You just have a network running because you need to get some work done. Let's say you are running a company, you want your users or your employees to be able to do email or web or whatever, but you don't want your own network to be used for innovation. That's not what you have that network for. Another reason for that is that the type of services that users expect from the network are those services that they already know. So there's no real motivation right now to actually change that completely. For example, allow end-to-end connectivity, because we don't really have a killer application that is actually requiring that functionality. And last but not least, if we were to, let's say, reinstall end-to-end connectivity, that of course would increase host exposure, which would mean that nowadays, for example, you may have all your hosts behind a NAT or firewall, and to some extent that may prevent some attacks. But if we were to change that and we were to put all of our devices directly connected to the internet, then that would mean that if some zero-day vulnerability was found, that just by sending a single packet you gain access to some system, then all of your systems could quickly become owned just because you are providing end-to-end connectivity to them. What I think about this topic is that end-to-end connectivity is not necessarily something that you decide for every network, and that in practice, IPv6 won't return this end-to-end connectivity. As a data point, Comcast is probably one of the ISPs that is most known for pushing IPv6 deployment. And when they deploy IPv6 to their customers, they deploy at the border of their network a stateful firewall that essentially only allows outgoing connections. So essentially, from that point of view, you have exactly the same thing as you have with the NAT, with the only difference is that in the case of IPv6, you have global addresses for each of the nodes. But when it comes to connectivity, in that case, you cannot get to the inside network, to the internal network from the outside. So, a couple of words about address resolution. Address resolution is essentially about mapping an IPv6 address into a link layer address. That's the same thing that you do in IPv4 with the ARP protocol. In the case of IPv6, it employs a protocol or a set of protocols that is called neighbor discovery. Neighbor discovery is based on ICMP version 6 messages. For the purpose of address resolution, it employs neighbor solicitation and neighbor advertisement messages. Those are analogous to ARP request and ARP response packets. And the key difference here between the two is that in the case of neighbor discovery, since the protocol runs on top of IPv6, these messages can, for example, be fragmented and so on. That's a key difference when you compare that with IPv4, because since ARP runs on top of Ethernet, for example, the ARP packets cannot get fragmented, so the traffic is very simple. However, in the case of V6, since these ICMP messages run on top of IPv6, you can get fragmentation. Those packets may employ extension headers and so on. So what are the possible vulnerabilities and the corresponding countermeasures for them? Well, it's essentially the same as you have in the IPv4 case. So you could spoof neighbor solicitations and neighbor advertisements. So you can essentially perform man-in-the-middle or denial of service attacks. And there are a number of possible countermeasures that you can deploy in the case of V6. One of them is to deploy SEND. SEND is like a very complex technology that essentially tries to incorporate authentication in neighbor discovery. So it's a way to actually sign every neighbor solicitation and neighbor advertisement message. You can use RSA signatures and so on. Another possible, I wouldn't say mitigation, but it's just monitoring or it's just a detection technique, is to try to monitor neighbor discovery traffic. Monitoring neighbor discovery traffic would be something very similar to what tools such as ARPWatch can do in the IPv4 world. Another one is to employ static entries in the neighbor cache. That's essentially the same thing as you have with ARP. If you do static entries, then you don't need the protocol to actually perform the mapping. And obviously, you can also restrict the access to the local network, so that if you segment the network, then you reduce the number of systems that the attacker can attack. So these are the problems with these mitigation techniques. SEN is essentially very, very hard to deploy. There are a number of reasons for that. First of all, it requires a PKI, so you can think that the implications of that should be obvious. It's painful to deploy, and also it's not widely implemented. So, for example, I don't know what's the case for Windows 7, 8, but at least in the case of Vista, it didn't implement SEND at all. So even if you were through all the hassle of trying to deploy SEND, there will be many implementations that you wouldn't be able to protect with SEND. I talked before about monitoring tools. The problem with those tools is that they are very trivial to circumvent. And the reason for that is that, as I said before, neighbor discovery packets can be fragmented. So essentially, you can apply the same techniques that we all know from the IPv4 world, just fragmenting the packets so that it's hard for a device that is on the link to actually monitor those packets. And a key difference between, let's say, the IPv4 case in some cases, is that if you're trying to monitor neighbor discovery traffic, then it's going to be a layer 2 device and that is going to monitor that traffic, and you cannot, let's say, do a man in the middle. You cannot have like a device that reassembles the packets to inspect them and then forward those packets. You are operating in layer 2. The other one that I mentioned was the use of static entries. Of course, that solution doesn't scale. There may be a few scenarios in which you may use that technique, but of course that's not applicable for the general case. Nobody could ever think of, let's say, adding static entries for a 500 host network. So that's just theory. And obviously, that of actually restricting access to a network is something that you cannot always do, and in many cases you don't even want to do that, because in many, if not all cases, you want a network to be easily accessible by other hosts. So the situation is not that different between V6 and V4, and actually it's a little bit more complicated in V6. The reason for that being that the traffic is much more complex in the case of V6 than in the case of V4. In this slide, you also have the file name of another internet draft that we published. Essentially, this draft tries to address some of these issues. Couple of words about auto configuration. In IPv6, you have essentially two different mechanisms for auto configuration: SLAC and DHCP version 6. SLAC is mandatory, whereas the DHCP version 6 is optional. The basic operation of SLAC is that a host will send ICMP router solicitations and will receive the network configuration in router advertisements. That's a very basic way of doing auto configuration. And the possible vulnerabilities, of course, are trivial. An attacker could be connected to the local network and just spoof the router advertisement messages and perform all kinds of attacks, from man-in-the-middle attacks to denial of service and so on. In most cases, the possible countermeasures are the same. In most cases, the countermeasures are the same. All of them are the same one as before, with the addition of another one that is router advertisement guard. Router advertisement guard is something analogous to DHCP snooping. And the problem with router advertisement guard is it's very trivial to evade. So I would say that in most cases, all of the possible mitigations that you have cannot really be successfully deployed in practice. Again, when you compare the V6 situation with the V4 situation, the V6 situation is a little bit worse, and there is lots of work to do in that case. A couple of words about IPv6 support. To put it shortly, IPv6 support is optional in the case of both protocols. It used to be mandatory for IPv6. Nobody cared about that. So you had IPv6 implementations that didn't implement IPv6 support even when it was supposed to be mandatory. And even the IETF acknowledged this fact, and they removed that requirement from IPv6 implementations. So conclusion is that you shouldn't expect, there is no reason to expect increased IPv6 use with IPv6 deployment. Couple of words about security implications of transition and coexistence technologies. The original idea or the original plan for V6 deployment was dual stack. So we would be deploying V6 in parallel with V4. Way before we needed IPv6, that of course failed. So right now there are let's say the current plan for V6 deployment is based on a toolbox. So you have many different transition and coexistence technologies, dual stack, tunnels, translation, and so on. And many operating systems implement many of these transition technologies. The implications of these transition technologies is, first of all, that they increase the complexity of the network, and if the network is more complex, there is more room for trouble. In many cases, they introduce single points of failure, so now you have the whole network depend on a single system. And also, many of these technologies raise privacy concerns. So many people, for example, use tunnels to get IPv6 connectivity, but in many cases, they don't consider that they are sending all of their traffic to some remote node somewhere else. So that's something that should be taken into consideration. Another one is that as a result of transition coexistence technologies, the resulting traffic is much more complex. This is probably the most ridiculous example, which is the resulting packet for using Tirido. And the bottom line with this slide is that the resulting traffic is much, much more complex than the traffic that you have in before. A simple exercise to realize how complex this is and how harmful this can be is that if you want, for example, to implement a lead pickup filter to detect, let's say, a packet sent to some specific V6 address and some specific TCP port, it's completely painful. This means that in many cases it's much, much harder, if at all possible, to, for example, do deep packet inspection in the case of transition technologies. Couple of words about security implications of V6 on V4 networks. To put it shortly, many systems, if not more general purpose operating systems, they implement different types of IPv6 support from dual stack to different transition technologies. So in practice, you don't really have an IPv4 only network. There's always at least partial V6 deployment. You may not be using IPv6, but you do have IPv6 partially deployed on those systems. Implications of that is that that dormant IPv6 support could be enabled by an attacker, and there are, for example, some transition technologies that can increase host exposure. For example, if you have a Windows system and you're running Teredo, Teredo actually is meant to allow NAT traversal, so that will mean that if your system is using Teredo, some host in the public network could be able to get inside your internal network by exploiting Teredo. Bottom line with this is that even if you are not planning to deploy V6, well, you still have to deal with IPv6 security, and you should still consider the security aspects that we are discussing. So, closing this presentation, these are some areas in which I think that further work is needed. First of all, lots of work to be done in the case of IPv6 implementations. So, as I said before, probably if you take a look at current IPv6 implementations, they have the same level of maturity that V4 implementations had in the 90s. One of the reasons for that is that we don't have that many attack or assessment tools to actually evaluate their resiliency. I think that there are only two toolkits that are available for doing V6 attacks or V6 assessment. So there are lots of bugs and vulnerabilities to be found, and of course to be patched and so on. Another one is to improve and increase the V6 support in security devices. As I said before, if we don't have parity of features between V6 and V4, we won't be able to implement or enforce the same security policies. And finally, it's that of education and training. I mean, it's completely insane to actually try to deploy V6 without actually being trained and without actual experience in V6. Unfortunately, in many cases, many organizations wait till the last minute, and then they realize that they need V6 deployment, because if not, they cannot get more customers. So they end up deploying these protocols without actually without proper training and expertise. And as some conclusions of these presentations, first of all, beware of IPv6 marketing and technology. It's very usual to see many people trying to sell IPv6 and make lots of claims from quality of service, security, and so on. Usually, if you just trust those claims, you are going to assume things that are not actually correct, and that may lead you to overlook, for example, security implications. When it comes to the service that IPv6 provides, it's essentially the same as the one that you have with V6. The difference is the underlying mechanisms that are used to provide that service, and the devil lies in the details. So you should pay attention to that too. As I mentioned before, most systems include IPv6 support enabled by default, so there's no such a thing as a V4 only network. So you should consider these implications. And finally, even if you are not thinking right now about V6 deployment, sooner or later you will deploy it. So you should consider these implications. I don't know if there are any questions. So this is my email address. If you have questions, you can fire them by email. We also have an email, a mailing list for IPv6 hacking. There's like 1,000 subscribers to that. So feel free to contact with questions if you want. Thank you.